It's 5 to 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7.
Well, hello again, Islands at War podcast here, Keith Pengelly, and also
Nick Lahure. Hi.
Hi, and welcome to everybody, and thank you for your continued support. We're now back on our monthly schedule, and in January 2025, we're actually going back now to January 1942, so we're sort of in sync, certainly, at the moment. So the first thing that we want to do, well, firstly, I'd like to thank Nick for his programme last week with Jan
Markey,
yes,
yep.
I nearly said something else, but Jan Markey, and it's done exceptionally well. And if you've missed it, then you can find that up on GNet Radio, Mixcloud, or indeed all of the podcast platforms that we are currently on. I can wholeheartedly recommend that programme. So anyway, back to January 1942. We kick off with food, always an ever-present, Nick, in people's minds.
Yeah, absolutely, throughout the occupation.
And we go to Herbie Winterflood, who picked up some things from the press in a book of his that came out about 30 years ago. Colonel Nakfus, this eminence gris, this sort of punitive officer that had been embedded in a command structure on the island, Nakfus ordered that nobody should sell foodstuffs direct to Germans or to people employed by them. Presumably this was organisation Todnik, but they were not slave workers because they wouldn't have...
Yeah, no, the slave workers wouldn't be able to buy stuff.
So why would local merchants or shop owners not be able to sell directly to German troops?
Well, this is the Germans finally doing something, addressing a problem that had been around since the start of the occupation, which was essentially, if you've listened to any of the earlier episodes, you'll know that they went around just buying up absolutely everything in sight. There was the German officer that I mentioned who complained that the shop wouldn't sell him another 500 tins of salmon. So they were basically going around buying up everything in sight, and that was causing a massive problem with feeding the local population. There was, of course, rationing, but if the Germans were just allowed to buy whatever they wanted, that caused massive problems. So this is an attempt to address that.
Yeah, so it's not a punitive order. It's actually to some degree to protect the civilian market.
Yeah, albeit 18 months too late.
Yeah, exactly. And also, farmers were prohibited from selling their produce without permission, and if they continued to do so, this would bring down severe penalties upon themselves. And of course, this is a variation on the same thing.
Yeah, a variation on a theme, and they could either just be fined. You see various different penalties for breaches regarding food. You could be fined, sent to prison, or in worst case scenario, you get sent to prison off island.
Yes, and continuing on the food theme, one of our diarists, Mr. Sovery, he put a little sort of gag into one of his diary entries in January 1942, and he was saying that the states, our government, allowed farmers to keep half of each pig that they slaughtered. So what the farmers were doing is they were sending in the forequarters and keeping the hindquarters for themselves. And of course, this is where most of the meat is on a pig. The government soon figured this out and then orders the pigs to cut down the centre of the spine. And Mr. Sovery adds, trust a Guernsey farmer.
Yeah, absolutely.
To be cute in this manner. Okay, and then our other diarist, Reverend Ord, comments on the shortage of seed potatoes, and in fact, Sovery also does the same, and is quite surprised when he's been able to pick some up, because a shortage of seed potatoes means that there'll be a shortage of main crop later on in the year.
Which had been a problem, as we've talked about in earlier episodes, where the Germans blamed the potato farmers for not declaring the correct amounts of potatoes that they were growing, and saying that they were declaring much higher numbers than they'd actually grown, which clearly was not going to be the case, because they'd have had to hand it over a higher percentage of what they had actually grown, so it would be self-defeating.
Yeah.
It was the Germans just trying to cover up the fact that basically they'd they'd taken a lot of the supply of potatoes. Therefore, being able to get seed potatoes was more difficult, and you needed those to be able to increase the crop for the following year.
Yeah, I mean, there was an ongoing narrative from the Germans that the island's farmers were not as productive as German farmers, but of course they completely missed the fact that this is a small island. Conditions were far different to massive fields that were in Germany.
They brought in farming experts from Germany. Now, these farming experts clearly didn't understand that the type of soil here was completely different. For example, particularly around the coastal areas, a lot of very low-lying sandy areas, and the crops they tried to grow and techniques that they tried to use just don't work here. It was the wrong type of soil.
No, and of course, not only would there have been a shortage of seed potatoes, but the quality would have diminished, and of course the land hadn't had the manure on, and etc.,
exactly.
etc.
Yep.
So yields were naturally falling, but we don't want to get bogged down in matters farming. And so we're going to move on to some interesting items here. Again, Winterflood writes that appearing in the Guernsey Evening Press on January the 2nd, Hitler's New Year proclamation, Hitler calling on the rank and file to pray to Almighty God to give German people and their soldiers the strength to secure their freedom and their future.
Yeah, which is interesting because, of course, a few days earlier, the German censor had tampered with the message from the Vicar of St. Stephen's to the people of Guernsey, so that is interesting.
This was followed by Lord Haw-Haw. To wish my British listeners a happy new year would be a grim jest bordering on bad taste. Lord Haw-Haw, well, he was actually Irish, but regarded as a British-born Englishman who was broadcasting for Berlin, a traitor, and in fact he was hung, wasn't he?
He was, yeah.
After the year. So his British listeners wouldn't have been only Channel Islanders. It would have been more so any British person listening.
The Germans loved reprinting stuff from his radio broadcasts on the front page of the Guernsey Press. So you couldn't get away from it. Everybody knew it was a load of rubbish. But hey.
We also had this tragic incident, Nick, with a civilian being accidentally shot. Well, can you talk us through that?
Yeah. So this is a particularly tragic event. So for those of you familiar with the island of Guernsey, this event happened in the Collings Road States Houses, or rather in and around that area. And people think about the occupation forces here being all very well behaved, which was not always the case. They did have a habit of firing off their guns to willy-nilly when they're celebrating things, particularly if they'd got drunk. So this gentleman, George Fisher, he lived in the States Houses at Collings Road. It was New Year's Eve, and he was having a small party, and a bunch of Germans gate crashed his party. Now, I'm sure he didn't want them there, but quite what do you do when a group of drunken Germans turn up?
With guns?
With guns. They've got revolvers and a large quantity of booze and demand to be let in. So they were in his house and continued drinking. They had wine, and some accounts say that they had strong liquor. So it was coming up to midnight, and these Germans decided to go outside and start firing their revolvers. George Fisher, unfortunately, went outside to go and have a look to see what they were actually doing, and he was shot. Now, there is some discussion about whether that was as the result of an argument or whether it was accidental. The reports in the Star newspaper,
which was a bit coy, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, you got to remember the Germans are editing what is in the paper. So unfortunately this gentleman was shot and he died. Now, the Star newspaper reported the coroner's verdict that Fisher died from excessive hemorrhage caused by a bullet wound, and the Evening Press reported the tragedy, just published the name of the man, who was a non-commissioned officer who fired the shot and mortally wounded Fisher, and that basically that he'd been arrested. What is recorded in numerous accounts is that this NCO was actually so drunk when he fired his revolver he could hardly stand. But the newspapers were made to tactfully say that he was completely unnerved by the shock, but he was absolutely smashed when he was arrested. And that I think it's fairly clear from all of the accounts that was the case.
Trying to divert attention away from the drunkenness by saying that this being unnerved by the shock, and it's sort of in a way trying to perhaps, I wouldn't say decriminalise it, but also sort of cast doubt on how it came about.
Yeah, I suspect also they don't want it to look like that. They're a drunken rabble. So I don't know what's worse though. Is it worse that if he'd accidentally shot him and he hadn't been drunk, or if he was absolutely smashed and it was an accident? I really can't mind that. Which is a worse narrative to be putting in the paper for the public? So we know who the gentleman was who was killed. The name of the German NCO was published in the newspaper. I haven't got a note of it with me, actually. I forgot.
Well, it's interesting in the Guernsey press that it says tactfully that he was, as you say, completely unnerved by the shot, and added that he'd been arrested by the German police pending a thorough investigation by the German authorities. What was the result of that investigation? We were never allowed to know.
No.
Now, that was at the time. Has anything come to light since?
Don't know what happened to him.
No. So we don't know really what the outcome was in general terms, and we don't know what happened to the NCO. If he'd had been executed, for example, we would know. So I suspect he was just lost in the system.
Yeah, somewhere. I suspect he got posted elsewhere.
Yeah.
He probably found himself somewhere considerably colder and a lot further east than where we're sitting right now.
Yeah. Okay, moving on. There was, again, inevitably, German orders issued. The one in particular we're looking at here, German order warning that if anybody attempted to effect work being carried out by persons employed by the occupying forces, they could expect hard labour, imprisonment or a fine, and in serious cases, a death penalty may be pronounced. So really, if we had someone that either willingly or unwillingly had been press-ganged into working for the Germans, if anybody tried to subvert that in any way, do you think there were much cases of this, or was this just a German order in case it might happen, or was there any of evidence you might know about?
No, this is things like just being disruptive or bloody minded when it comes to doing the work. So by interfering with the work, what they mean is, if you're working on something for them, then you don't do the job properly, or you're doing it half-hearted, or whatever. That sort of thing, or doing something to deliberately sabotage it whilst you're actually doing the work.
Yeah, I think it's just the German bureaucracy as well.
And they loved to chuck in and in serious cases, the death penalty. It's on a lot of their notices, and some of them it just doesn't make sense, because we talked about the escaping thing. In serious cases of escaping, you might get the death penalty. Well, how do you define what a serious instance of escaping is? You're either escaped or you're trying to escape, or not.
It's an all-embracing term, isn't it?
But they loved having that on the bottom of their notices, just to try and intimidate the population and say, you might end up getting shot.
Okay, then interestingly, and we're going to address some of the entertainment that sprung up in the war. Dorothy Hurrell and Frank Stroobant. Now, Nick's going to talk a little bit about Frank Stroobant. He's well known over here, passed away some time ago, of course. But Dorothy Hurrell and Frank Stroobant announced that they were forming a new theatrical company, the Guernsey Co-Optimist Troupe, and the first showing would be at the Central Hall in February. Nick, in terms of the Central Hall, you've got something on the Co-Optimist Troupe?
Yeah, the Co-Optimist Troupe, as you say, Dorothy Hurrell, who went on to be Dorothy Hurrell Longley. She was a dance teacher, lived along Elm Grove at the time of the occupation, had a little dance studio there, and actually petitioned the Germans to get permission to start doing that, for running the dance studio for children primarily.
So we have the Guernsey Co-Optimist Troupe, and then also in January 1942, the Lyric Theatre in New Street was converting from a cinema to a venue for plays and variety shows, and the very first show was to be a farce or tons of money performed by the Amherstian players. And so we were aware that there were lots of little amateur groups that sprung up. And the reason, I suppose, that there were lots of them in localities was because of the curfew and getting away from rehearsals and things. And if someone had the time and inclination, there would be a fascinating book or monograph about entertainment during
there's a whole load. I've got loads of programs and things, but just going back to Dorothy Hurrell and Frank Stroobant and the Co-Optimist troupe, Frank was one of the people that used to write the plays that they did. They very cunningly, the censor Goettmann, who we talked about in the December 41 episode, Goettmann was appointed this month as being the censor. So they thought, we've got to take the script. The scripts of these shows had to go to the censor. Got to take the script to the censor. Who's going to take it? So you've got a whole bunch of blokes, or you've got a pretty young lady. Who do you think they sent? So Dorothy said, they had a chat. They all had a chat about it, and they decided that if they were going to try and sneak stuff past the censor, because there were a lot of things that were sneaked into some of these
covert messages, sort of.
Absolutely.
Subtle messages.
Subtle messages, things that were, slightly taking the mickey out of the Germans without the Germans, recognising by using slang and various other inferring things, shall we say, but through these things that the Germans didn't necessarily understand. Now, Goettmann, we have to remember, actually was a fluent English speaker and had lived in England. So that there is perhaps an element of either he was willing to let things go, which I think is probably unlikely because he was very strict when it came to the newspaper, but it was a different case than this, or whether, Dorothy just kept him distracted by talking to him, because she used to talk to him quite some length from an interview that I've listened to. She talked to him about the arts and things like that, and it would distract him from looking at the script quite so closely, and he'd give it back a bit later and say, okay, that's fine. He's crossed out a few bits or whatever that they can't do,
just to be seen to be doing something.
Yeah. So and Goettmann was a bit of a pain actually as a censor. Frank Fuller, who was the editor of Guernsey Press, he had dealings with him, and he recorded in his book The Silent War that when he used to go away on leave, they used to have another one of his underlings who would be in charge of dealing with the newspaper, etc., one of whom was a far more reasonable gentleman who had lived in Canada actually up until 1938. And we've talked about this happening before, but gone back to Germany in 1938 to visit family and not been allowed to leave. Now, he didn't like the Nazis and was much more easygoing on the Guernsey Press in terms of what they were reporting. So I digress slightly, but I just thought it was interesting about the censorship. So all of these groups would have had to submit their plays, and sometimes there were, I believe, one or two instances where plays started to be run and then the Germans demanded changes because someone in the audience worked out, hang on a minute, they're in a bit of a dig at us.
Well, I think if there's anybody that's listening that don't have to be resident here on Guernsey, but if anybody's got any relatives or know of any of their relatives that took part in these wartime theatre groups, we'd love to hear from people because it's fascinating. Any artifacts, programs, etc.
Yeah, I've got quite a few of the programs actually. I'll try and tweet some photos. I know if you go to the Occupation Museum as well, Richard James got a little display there of some of the programs and a profile of a few of the people, including Dorothy.
Well, maybe we could do later on in the year. Maybe we could do a special on entertainment during the occupation. Now, we've raised the name of Frank Stroobant, Nick, and he's going to be popping up quite a lot, certainly this year, for reasons which we'll eventually catch up with. And I'd like you shortly to give a little profile of Frank. He produced a book, certainly this one. I don't know if he wrote any others, but he wrote what has become a classic, One Man's War. This came out in mid-60s, something like that.
Yeah, I think it came out.
And I certainly read it around that time. And it would have been the first book that I read. And of course, we're only talking about probably when it came out just after 20 years since the cessation of the Second World War. And I would urge people to try and track copies of this down. We'll tweet a picture of the sort of classic cover later on. But Frank, Nick, can you give us a little sort of profile of Frank Stroobant?
Yeah, he was an extremely well-liked young man. Excellent sportsman. He played cricket for Guernsey. He played in inter-island matches. He was also played in the Marathi, which I know you've been talking on Radio Guernsey and Radio Jersey about.
So that would have meant he played for Guernsey as a footballer.
Yeah, as a footballer as well. So yeah, he was an excellent sportsman. Every single account that I've seen of him has been most complimentary about him, both in his sporting ability and how he behaved in himself. He actually ran a cafe with someone that we've talked about before, which was Bill Symes, who we talked about not so long ago, who was related to one of the commandos that was here, and also got himself into trouble and ended up getting deported. But one of the things that I just think is remarkable that Frank Stroobant did was there are several accounts of him holding parties for people that are about to be deported.
This was in his restaurant in town called The First and Last, wasn't it?
Yeah.
This was sort of Pollet area.
I can't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah,
exactly
near the
where
Weybridge Pollet area. Yeah.
But he also used to go and he basically was like almost outside catering at people's houses as well when they were about to be deported, and if they were having a party or whatever, he'd go along and make sure that, which given that having food was difficult. He even, and I just think this is brilliant. He was deported in 1943 himself, but he actually kept feeding the deportees down at the harbour while they were waiting to be put on the boat, even though he was going to be put on the boat as well. And he actually got awarded a silver engraved mug with a message from the bailiff later on for doing that. He also is well known for experimenting with foodstuffs, so much so that he actually almost killed himself with one of his experiments where he was using linseed oil and created a large clouds of smoke, and that meant that he obviously he almost gassed himself in his restaurant. He tried all sorts of things with limpets and
cormorant. There's an account in One Man's War where he caught a cormorant and ate it. And if you want to know what happens, get a copy of One Man's War.
Yeah, I don't think we want to go into that on here.
No. In fact, Frank, during this year, 2025, I think Nick and I are going to try and end up in December 2025 at December 1943. And if we keep on track of that, we will cover the deportations, and Frank plays a big part in both of those. Nick, I went down to the White Rock this week to take a photograph of the plaques that commemorate certain events down at the White Rock. And the plaque that commemorates the deportation is in a shocking state. It's unreadable. It's absolutely terrible. It really needs to be renovated for this year, which is, of course, at the 80th anniversary of the liberation.
I haven't been down for a while, to be honest.
No, and in fact, I mentioned it, the Channel Island Occupation Society committee meeting. I'm a member of the society, and there's going to be an effort to put some pressure on to get that plaque back into shipshape fashion, because it's shocking how it's been allowed to deteriorate, especially in this particular year. Yeah, so much more to come about Frank.
Yeah, absolutely, and the Stroobant family were involved in quite a lot of different things. There was a Stroobant's Wines and Spirits, I believe, which I don't know too much about, but I
remember seeing the vans on the road in the 60s and 70s.
Still around in the 60s and 70s, I believe.
They were, and the deportations particularly are going to feature very soon. I actually remember Frank as an old man. He used to set up a stall at Oatlands. People over here that are listening and expatriates would know that where Oatlands is, and he would be sat there selling copies of One Man's War. This would have probably been into the 80s. He's actually buried in St Martin's Parochial Cemetery, not far from Desmond, Mulholland, but that's another story. Okay, more Frank to come during this year. Now, I wanted to mention also another well-known character at the time, and certainly into I think he died in the early 60s, was again, we sort of reported on this, but a local shop in St Peter Port was offering to park cycles at twopence a bike. So the shop looked after your bicycle when you were doing your business in town, going about your business in town. But this particular store was in charge of one Steve Piquet. Now, Steve Piquet was a very interesting character who post-war lived as a hermit with loads and loads of goats in a bunker out towards Plymouth, and it would be that bunker set into the cliff, Nick, just before that.
Yeah, on that curve.
Yeah,
on
that
curve in the road, if you know where.
Exactly.
Where there was actually, you can still see where the Germans had a barrier there.
Yeah.
They used to come down the two bits from the either side.
Now, you've heard me mention in past the Guernsey classic. It is a fictitious book, the Book of Ebenezer Le Page, which has a narrative that goes from the 1890s up to the 60s. But of course, it does in places relate to the Second World War. And Steve Piquet is one of the few real people that actually features in the Book of Ebenezer Le Page. So if the name sort of piques your interest, then quite a few books relate to him, and he's quite a character, and there's various pictures floating around of him.
But didn't he call his bunker On Me Own?
Yes, On My Own, yeah. And I remember my grandparents talking about him. He was a boxer, and I think he's sort of a man that lived outside of society, and from what I understand, he basically ignored the occupation.
Yeah, I think he did to a certain extent.
So anyway, Steve Piquet, real-life character, turning up for real in our history and in fiction with Ebenezer Le Page. Okay.
I'm intrigued by one of the other things that you turned up as well, which was attempts to buy Benedictine liquor from the continent. Now, we've talked about trying to obtain stuff from France, wine being foisted, poor quality wine, etc., on the buying authorities here by the French and the Germans. But you turn this up, Keith, attempts to buy Benedictine liquor from the continent. But there were no bottles to transport the drink, so islanders were then invited to sell suitable bottles to local wine merchants for dispatch to France for filling in return. Yes, you looked this up, and I've had a look as well. Because I don't remember seeing this when I've been in France, but yeah, apparently it does. It's a bit like it sounds like a hybrid between brandy and gin, because it's made with 27 herbs and spices and peels, so a little bit like a gin. You've got lots of herbs and things in it. It says here the flavour is smooth and sweet like honey, and also it has a subtle taste of licorice to it. I'm not convinced myself, but
I don't think licorice is ever subtle.
It's like brandy, but bit thicker. It's now starting to sound like vinos to me.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what it sounds like to me. Is the fruit punch that people used to make up at parties. Where you just basically chuck everything in a dustbin.
Oh, it sounds a little bit awful.
Well, I think if it was a choice between a cup of bramble tea and a glass of Benedictine, I probably would go down the Benedictine route. And of course, this all points towards the shortages that were kicking in of nearly everything across the islands during the occupation. Reverend Ord reporting that dentists can't get supplies of many things, including anaesthetic, and extractions are now without anaesthetic. And not only does that sound pretty gruesome, but you've got to remember people were really debilitated because of malnutrition now, and lots of accounts turned up in January 1942 of people falling dead in the street. And so if you had to have your tooth out on top of all this misery, it would have been,
Yeah, and the thing with the anaesthetics though was obviously they had a limited supply. So the government here are buying in anaesthetic from France when they can get it, along with other medical supplies, and they effectively sort of triaged the usage of those medical supplies. Is it more important to use that anaesthetic for an operation on some sort of major operation on somebody, or is it more important to do it when you're pulling someone's tooth out?
Yeah, well,
clearly they're going to go for we'll let the doctor that's carrying out surgery on someone have the anaesthetic, not the dentist. So
and that didn't just happen here. I mean, my mother lived in London during all of the Second World War. I remember her telling me that she had to have dental work done without anaesthetic, and that's as a child, and that's in London. Ord also records the Red Cross dealt with in 1941 107,366 Red Cross messages. And Nick, that would have been messages going out and also coming back in.
Yeah, absolutely. That's in and out. But initially I looked at that number and went, oh, that's actually quite a lot, isn't it?
Well, for the head of population.
Well, yeah, but it's not really when you think about it. That's your only mode of communication. You got 21,000-ish people here, and if you're trying to communicate with your relatives, that's only 5 messages in a year.
Yeah. And of course, at that point, people would have sent messages towards the back end of 1941, and you had yet to have the reply.
And if you think about those 5 messages, roughly each, that's in and out, so that's 2.5 messages, roughly, in a year.
Yeah, was there an age limit as to when you could that you could send a message?
I have no idea, actually. I'll have to have a look at that.
Because that's, if you think about it, if you were a couple with 2 children and the children were small, I wonder if you could send out messages on their behalf.
No, I suspect that wouldn't have been allowed because
it must have been after 21 or something.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I will look into that. Yeah. But if you look at a lot of the Red Cross, we've been very kindly sent some by a lady from Australia this week. If you look at a lot of the Red Cross messages, it's basically signed off on behalf of all the family.
Yeah.
So, it tends to be mum, dad, or where it's individuals, it tends to be that they're the, dad's been left behind and mum and the kids are in the UK.
Yes, Nick alluded to the lady in Australia that kindly got in touch with us on occupied@gnetradio.com. That's the address, email address, should you wish to get hold of myself or Nick. Several people have done and continue to do so, and we continue to thank them. So thank you.
Yeah, we'll talk about the stuff that Elizabeth has sent through to us, perhaps in the next episode.
Yeah, so thank you again, Elizabeth. But keep all the, we hesitate to say fan mail, but keep all the communications coming. We thoroughly enjoy receiving them. Back to Reverend Ord. Again, he's because he's very, very connected with funeral services and things, he because of his role of a minister, he records that in the first 6 months of the occupation, so that would have been, let's say, the first year of 1940, 73 males and 54 females died, and in all of 1941, 154 males and 120 females died, and regrettably, older people were succumbing to the effects of malnutrition. It led so much illness and death. It's really starting to become quite apparent now in the early part of 1942. And in fact, we go back to Sovery, Mr. Sovery, who was a builder carpenter as well as a churchman. He reports many people dying over the winter of 1941 into 42, and he was finding it difficult in obtaining wood for coffins.
Yeah, a constant problem because the Germans were wanting the wood for other things.
Okay, and we're going to sort of turn our attention to raids that under our military section of the programme. There were some heavy raids in the early part of the year. Now, we have RAF attacks on gun positions on the 2nd of January and lots of activity on the 7th. These are sort of opportunistic raids, tip and run raids, I think you call them.
some of them are planned, but generally speaking, it's just opportunistic. They're out on patrol and they see something worth attacking.
And then Sovery alludes to a Mr. Tucker that was killed in a raid. Sovery writes that the funeral was well attended and that German officials took wreaths. What was the backstory there, Nick?
Yeah, so Tucker was a crane driver, so he's sat in his crane and down at the White Rock at the harbour in St. Beaufort. Now, as I tell you a bit more of this story, you'll probably understand why that's probably the last place you wanted to be right at that moment. And also, sadly, why he ended up being killed. So we're recording this episode of the podcast on the 18th of January 25. Yesterday was, in fact, the 83rd anniversary of this raid by number 82 Squadron Coastal Command of the RAF.
So this is a planned, dedicated attack on St. Peter Port, and you're going to talk us through this.
And there were quite a few attacks that were planned on the islands. So I think people overlook this to a certain extent. There are one or two well-known ones, and then I think people just kind of think, oh, that's it. That they wouldn't have really been attacking very often, but that's not the case. There were a lot of attacks on the island, be it either opportunistic because they were coming back from somewhere else and just attacked and saw something worth attacking, or they were out on patrol. So these aircraft took off at 9:17 in the morning from St Eval, I think that's how you pronounce it, on the south coast of England. There were 3 Beaufort aircraft from 82nd Squadron, and they flew. I've got a copy of the report in their squadron operations book.
So can I just intercede, as you say, is this Coastal Command?
Yeah.
Is this RAF? It's still part of RAF.
It's still part of the RAF, but it's Coastal Command. And they were very active around the Channel Islands. That we could talk for quite a while about that. But just going back to this raid, the squadron operations book records that they flew in formation to St Peter Port, Guernsey, attacked a 40-foot motor vessel alongside St Julian's Pier and the White Rock Pier. The attack was made from less than 100 feet in line astern, and they dropped 4 500-pound bombs, 2 of general purpose 500-pound bombs, and 12 250-pound general purpose bombs. And they had delay fuses on them as well on some of the other bombs that they dropped.
So can I just again, did they know what they were after? They
were after the shipping that was in.
Yeah.
So basically, there was a whole lot of shipping that had arrived with equipment for the Germans for building the fortifications. So the squadron record book goes on to report direct hits were scored on sheds in the middle of the jetty, and bursts seen from the direction of the ship. Excellent photographs were taken of the attack. Soldiers in uniform were machine gunned. Now, there are a number of reports on this, and the reference to photographs is an interesting one, because I have some copy of a photograph, and you can see how low it's quite a rare one, because you don't see many photographs of RAF raids on the Channel Islands for various reasons. But this is actually a photograph taken from one of the Beauforts that was on the raid, and it shows another of the Beauforts flying. But bearing in mind, they said they took from below 100 feet. This other Beaufort that's in the shot is below the one. It's line astern of the aircraft where the photographer was, but it's actually below that, and it looks by quite some margin. I'd imagine that he's probably at about 50 feet, which is probably why they were using delayed fuses on the bombs.
Yes, exactly.
On the bombs, but it did cause the death of Mr. Tucker, but it also, there were other people that were offloading the ships. So it's good that we've got the squadron record of what happened, because there are varying different accounts, and I find this interesting, that even though these people are writing down the same an account of,
this is people in Guernsey
writing down
what they saw or thought they saw,
what they saw or what they thought they saw. And it goes back to the thing that a lawyer friend and a policeman friend of mine have said, you can be at the scene of something and interview 3 different people who were stood in 3 different, slightly different places, and they'll all tell you slightly different things. That's just how it pans out. But there's one account, don't have that one with me, but because it's only a very brief one, but the diarist there says that they swooped down with their engines switched off before they dropped the bombs, and then started their engines. They didn't do that.
No.
I can confidently say. You just wouldn't do that. That would be a very silly thing to do. But there is a report, Captain Franklin, who's the civilian harbour master. So remember, we've got a German harbour master and a civilian harbour master who are forced to work together. He gave an account of what had happened. He himself had a miraculous escape, because his office was in one of those sheds that was bombed. And he watched 3 planes flying very low, coming down the Russell from the north. So that's approaching St. Peter Port from England effectively, when they reached the harbour wall, they had to rise and hedge hop. The first thing Captain Franklin saw was 4 square things like brown parcels falling and the deafening explosions of the bombs. 2 of the biggest boats that come here were moored on the east side of a jetty, the H7 and H8, the latter ship of 8,000 tons. 1 bomb fell in the hold of the H8, which was full of cement and being unloaded by those poor French and Dutch labour men that were killed. They were all blown to pieces. A crane was wrecked and the driver, a Guernseyman named Tucker, was killed. Another bomb fell on the stern of the second ship, doing great damage, breaking the back of a barge alongside of it. And a third bomb fell on the jetty, killing a number of men. And the fourth is said to be unexploded on the barge, which has been towed into the inner harbour. Now, that's seems to me like the last place that you would want to go and put it if it's got an unexploded bomb in it. But there we go. The diarist here actually records, "So nice for the town if it goes off," which could be a problem. But also, this diarist is quite interesting because they compare it to what the report was on the 9 o'clock news.
This is the BBC official news.
Yeah, so they listened to the BBC later in the day, and the BBC talks about them flying over the island and machine gunning troops drilling in a country mansion. Apparently, that's Sunbury Park. But they obviously, the diarist here is saying, we don't get to know about German casualties. They don't tell us these things. One of the pilots that took part was Canadian. He gave an account to the BBC. He said the troops ran like hell. But the thoughts of people here was it was a bloody good show, is what the diarist records. And back to our friend in Jersey, Mr. Lesota. He again he's quite quiet in his diary in January 1942, which he explains actually with an entry towards the end of the month that his assistant has been tied up doing other things, so he's been too busy to write his diary. But one of the things he does put in his diary is, so Guernsey's getting all the attention again from the RAF. You may remember we talked about him complaining bitterly that Guernsey was getting that he hadn't been bombed enough, and it's a current theme. So I've got some, as I say, I've got a photograph of that I can tweet out.
We can tweet that out. Yeah,
I've also written an article about it as well, which I'll put the link out on the social medias. But that's quite an interesting raid. It got a lot of publicity in the British newspapers at the time. That photograph of the Beaufort very low over the harbour, that made it into the British newspapers a few days later.
Well, so would that have been a sort of organised effort to get some news out in the UK about activity in the Channel Islands?
Yeah, absolutely, just to show that they were doing something about it.
Yeah.
But that's very, very little gets written about the raids. Now, I don't know if it's partly because they don't want to worry people.
Oh, right, yes, of course. Can we go back to what actually happened, if you know, to Mr. Tucker, is it? The crane driver.
He was
just caught.
Yeah, he was.
Was that an explosion or?
I believe it was an explosion that did for him, unfortunately. But there are some great photographs from a week after in the Illustrated London News, which has got some more photographs of St. Peterport taken by the aircraft.
So would they have been photographing to record the raids specifically for this reason, to put some PR out almost, or would it have been quite usual operationally to take photographs?
I think they were probably doing it as part of the operation because they wanted to see what shipping was there that they'd actually dropped bombs on.
And so they would have been, as a follow-up, it would have been quite routine to go back and photograph what had been achieved. Yeah,
they would have gone back and taken other photographs, but these are clearly actually during the course of the raid because you can see the other aircraft. There's a couple of shots that I've got where you can see a boat. There's one Beaufort where it looks like he's just above the mast of one of the ships that got hit with the bombs.
And we've put Nick will tweet those photographs out when this pod goes live. It does say in it here, Nick, that the BBC say they flew over the island machine gunning troops drilling in the courtyard of a country mansion. Somre Park.
Yeah.
But we're not told anything of German casualties. But we're having we've got a database of German dead.
I haven't looked, to be honest.
I'll look at that and we'll see if I can pinpoint those down. Yeah.
But yeah, that's probably. I mean, I could go into more detail on that, but I think we've probably covered enough on that in terms of that raid. But as I say, I'll put out some links to the article on that. I've also got some photographs of some, because you've got to remember at this point as well that the harbour was one of the most heavily armed areas in terms of anti-aircraft guns, etc. That point in the occupation, so you're basically attacking the thing that's most likely to get you shot down.
Yeah. So again, interesting that the Germans themselves attended the funeral and laid wreaths. Is this an attempt to sort of say, well, look, the British are not really looking after you? I mean, why would the Germans have sort of picked that one out to attend?
I don't know.
Solidarity, I suppose. Yeah.
I don't know what the motivation.
Mr. Tucker was the only civilian casualty, obviously.
He was, yeah.
So in terms of collateral damage, it would have been seen overall to have been a successful raid.
Yeah. Obviously not successful for the poor French and Dutch guys that were unloading the boats.
No, we mustn't forget them. And this ship that's towed into the harbour with a ticking or a live bomb, it presumably didn't go off and cause any damage, because we'd know, wouldn't we?
I'd know. We'd know if it had gone off. I presume they managed to defuse it. I've got some pictures as well from the Bundesarchive of a couple of the boats partially submerged in the harbour and being attempts being made to lift them. So we'll share those as well.
Okay. The other thing that picked out here was that German troops were seen to be having what was regarded as final training at Fort George. Now, Fort George was a military barracks dating from Napoleonic or post-Napoleonic times. The Germans, it had housed the British garrison when they were here. So the Germans were there, took control of that. But the final training was for troops being sent off to Russia.
Yeah, so the Fort George had been used for many, many years as a place to station British forces that were based in the island. And it's for those that don't know, it's now been converted into housing development. There's quite a number of houses up there, so a lot of it was lost when that was done in the 60s, but there are still parts of it up there that you can see. It was used for training by the Guernsey militia as well as the British Army. Lots of sort of Victorian bits and bobs up there. But also, again, it was the victim of RAF raids later on in the war, and this
lead up to D-Day, especially
in the lead up to D-Day, especially the Germans used it for radar. They had 3 radar up there, so it had multiple uses throughout the occupation. But like I say, it came in for some attention from the RAF. You can still see some of the bomb damage if you go and look, actually.
Well, I think we've got a relative buried up there in the military cemeteries from around the First World War, so I need to go up and tie off that up soon. There's quite a sad story about some children that picked up a hand grenade that had been used as part of an exercise up there, and unfortunately it went off and killed them. Well, this was during occupation.
Yeah.
Well, we'll get to that in due course. Okay, so we look forward to February 1942.
Yeah, we've got quite a bit coming up for February 1942, which we can talk about. We'll give you perhaps a bit of a run up on those in the days before we put that podcast episode out. But quite a lot happens in 42 onwards. There's a lot more things going on because the fortifications are in full flow in terms of building things, and there's an awful lot going on.
Yeah, so just a reminder of our email address, occupied@gnetradio.com, if you want to get in touch with Nick and myself. Some of you have, and we, as I mentioned earlier, very, very grateful. It's fantastic to hear of anything that links us back to the occupation, especially in this 80th year of anniversary of the liberation. That, of course, will be May the 9th, 2025. There's lots going on in support of that.
What I find it's one of those random things, but Elizabeth Mulligan, who wrote to us, who, as I say, we'll talk more about the things that she sent through in the next episode. But Elizabeth mentioned a few family names in the emails and the area of the island.
Yeah, the localities.
The localities of the island that we lived in. And I went back to Elizabeth because I thought, hang on a minute. These are names that these are family surnames and areas that I knew people with those surnames in those areas. But this lady Elizabeth lives in Australia. What are the chances that actually she's related to any other people that I know with those surnames, or that I knew with those surnames? And I inquired about one in particular, and said, don't suppose you're any relative of, and it turns out she's the niece of the gentleman that I mentioned, who was a friend of my parents, and also used to be a news agent, and I knew him well because I used to.
And this is from the Lillet locality, I think.
Yeah. So that was quite interesting. But we'll talk a little bit more about what Elizabeth. I didn't really have time to go through absolutely everything and come up with how we'd fit things in. So I wanted to give it the time that it deserves. So thank you very much, Elizabeth, for sending that in. Yeah.
Well, Nick has been doing a collation of our statistics. We've been going for 11 months.
Yep.
And last time we spoke, we were approaching 8,000 downloads.
We're well past that.
Growing exponentially, and over 50 countries in the world. But mostly we're being listened to in UK and Guernsey.
Yep.
But we have also people listening in numbers in the United States and Australia.
Yeah, so between Guernsey and Jersey and the UK, that's about 60% of our listenership.
Yeah.
And closely followed by, we've got the United States, Australia and Canada, which coincidentally are places where lots of Channel Island folk tend to end up when they left the island.
Yes, in fact, I've been contacted by people in Australia in terms of family connections, and both sides of my father's family. People that wouldn't have been known to one another contacted me because of the research I've been doing about that. So we thank you for your continued support, which is growing. And like I say, get in touch with us on that email address, occupied@gnetradio.com, with anything that you feel is relatable to podcast,
or just any questions. If you've got any questions about the occupation that you.
If we don't know, we know men who do.
Yeah, indeed. And all women that know as well.
Yes.
So, if you've got a specific question, do feel free to write in, and we'll do our best to address it for you.
Okay. And how's the blog going?
The blogs, I haven't written too much on the blog recently. I'm concentrating on the book because I need to get it done. The archives are closed at the moment as well because they've had to close from some emergency work.
The blog is called
islandfortress.com.
And how can people get to engage with that?
Yeah, if you just put in Island Fortress into Google and Guernsey, it'll come up.
It'll find you.
It comes up near the top. So yeah, you can find me on there. There's contact details on there if you need to get hold of myself. You can find us on social media as well. So Islands at War is on what everyone like me still calls Twitter, but X. We're on there, just at Islands at War, so you can follow our social media there.
Have we got a Blue Sky presence, Nick?
No, we haven't yet. I haven't organised that yet.
No.
But we will be having a Blue Sky presence. I just haven't. This is the only problem with things sort of spreading across various different social platforms at the moment. It makes it quite unwieldy to
spinning plates on sticks
to manage everything. But we've also got a Facebook page as well, where we share various bits and pieces as well. So you can find Islands at War there as well.
Okay, you're almost certainly picking this podcast up on Spotify, Amazon, Apple, etc., etc. But of course, it can be found at GNet Radio, www.gnetradio.com, which also has quality music programs. Our website is being updated in the next week or so. More information about that, and give our music shows a listen. We are recording this on the 18th of January, as Nick says. On the 26th of January, I shall be leading a walk from the Ecar area of Guernsey at 2 p.m. We'll be walking around the Ecar Strong Point and also visiting Loop Tower 14 above Saints Bay. And Loop Tower 14 will be open. My brother will talk us through the renovation of this Napoleonic loop tower, and he's promised to have the fire going as well, so it'll be nice and cosy in there. If you want to come on the tour, if you want to email me, keith@guernseywalkingtours.com, then get in touch and book your place on the tour. The tour will take about 2 hours. It'll be a sedate pace, but there is some rough terrain to cover in terms of walking up and down some cliff paths. So Keith at Guernsey Walking Tours, if you're inclined to come on that tour. So as I say, addresses World War II and also Napoleonic times, because there's a lot of intended Napoleonic activity in the Saints Bay area. Okay, so we will have February 43 will be our next program.
42.
Sorry, 42 in a couple of weeks' time, but we have many more specials lined up.
Yeah, we're working on those at the moment.
Okay, so we'll go up with a little bit of Jim, and so I'll reset that back to the beginning, and I suppose it's time to say our goodbyes, Nick. So it's goodbye from Keith.
And goodbye from me, Nick Lahiri.
À la prochaine. Bye-bye.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7.